All right. Well, I think we're live, and this is our children's story time for First Bible Church. And tonight we're finishing the story of missionary John Paton, missionary to the New Hebrides Islands. And if you children remember from the two previous weeks, some of the things that happened in John's life, you might remember how he grew up in Scotland in a small village, in a small cottage. His parents were saved. He came from a godly Christian home. And if you might remember, maybe the most important part of the story is the fact that when John was still a little boy, he asked Jesus Christ to save him. He got saved. And that's a wonderful day in anybody's life. I remember the day I got saved, and that's the most important day for any of us. But John Paton didn't just get saved. As a young man, he also gave his life to Jesus Christ. He asked God to use him in any way that God wanted to. And of course, you know by now that God decided to make a missionary out of John. And as a young man, he had many adventures. We won't tell those stories again. But eventually, the Lord took him to the city of Glasgow, and he began to learn how to preach in the street and visit and tell the gospel. Many people got saved, and he continued that work and was very successful. And then the Lord gave John a wife. And as two young people, they went to the New Hebrides as missionaries. And at first they landed on the island of Tanna, right? Tanna, I think was the name of it. And sadly, if you kids remember, it was only a year or so after John landed on the island that his wife, Mary, passed away, and then his little baby passed away. So suddenly, early in his ministry, John was all alone. But he continued his work on the island of Tanna, and many dangerous things happened. There were many times when John was almost killed by the natives. So many exciting stories from the last 2 weeks. But last week, if you remember, one of the things that happened is that John heard about some missionaries on the other side of the island that needed food. And it was very dangerous to try to cross the island on foot. So John and one of the chiefs and some men got a canoe and took the food in that canoe, and they sailed around the island to the other side. And if you remember what happened, the boat crashed as they were coming toward the shore, and John couldn't swim, and he was hanging on to the side of the boat, but he was rescued by one of the natives. And then they were able to get the food to those other missionaries. But now they had to get back home, and they couldn't take the boat. It was wrecked. And so John had to go across the middle of the island, and the other natives were too afraid to go with him. So John went alone. And I remember the part of the story. See, when you get a little older, you don't remember all these details, but now they're coming back to me. But as John was trying to cross the island, remember, there was one place where he had to climb up over a very large rock. And as he was climbing over this very large rock in the middle of the night, he came to a place in the trail where he couldn't go any further. And so he had to jump off this very high rock back down into the ocean. And if you remember, John can't swim. And so he was just trusting the Lord, and he asked the Lord for help. And he jumped off the top of that rock. And if the water had been too deep, he would have drowned, or if he had landed on the rocks, he would have been killed. And this was the middle of the night, so John just asked the Lord, he prayed, and he jumped. And he made it. He was safe. The water wasn't too deep, and there were no rocks, and so John was able to get back home. But, and then, if I remember, there was a part in the story where John... I should have reread the story last week. There was a part in the story where the natives were chasing John, trying to kill him, and so Chief Noir sent John with his son to a place in the jungle where he knew there was a very large tree, a chestnut tree, I think it said. And so John climbed up in this tree, and that's where we left John last week. Last week, our missionary hero was up in a tree in the middle of the night, and the natives were looking for him, trying to kill him. And so that's where the story begins again today. All right? John Paton was up in a tree in the middle of the night, and his enemies were all around him. But as John perched there in the tree almost until midnight, he prayed and prayed. Then far below him he heard a whisper. It was Chief Noir's son, and he said, "Come down, come down." And so John climbed down from the tree, and he and Chief Noir's son scrambled back together to see Chief Noir. Once more, like many times before this, God had protected John and kept him alive. The next few months of John's ministry were still very, very dangerous. It was becoming more and more dangerous to continue his work on Tanna. And so John decided he needed to go and get some help. And so he decided to go to Australia. Now, there were other missionaries in the New Hebrides on some of the other islands, but not enough missionaries. And there were many islands in the New Hebrides that had no missionary at all, and the people there had never heard of Jesus Christ. And so John decided to go get some help, go find other people to come back and help him preach the gospel in these islands. And so John got on a boat and sailed to Australia. And he said to himself, maybe there I can make people see how important it is to give money and even give themselves to come and help us. And I think that's the most important thing, not so much the money, although missionaries do need money. Our missionaries need money to buy, obviously, to take care of themselves and to take care of their families and to take care of their ministry. It requires money. But the most important thing for missionary work is that people give themselves, surrender themselves. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse number 5, Paul was talking about the idea of giving. And he was talking about money, about giving money. And he was using some Christians in Macedonia as an example. And he said about those Christians in Macedonia that they had first, they had given their own selves to the Lord. So the reason they were such a good example of how to give our money generously is because even before giving their money, they had already given themselves to the Lord. And if you remember, that's what John had done as a boy. He had given himself to the Lord. And that's the most important thing of all. In Romans chapter 6 and verse number 13, it says that we are to yield ourselves unto God. And that simply means that we just surrender our lives. We give our lives to the Lord, and we ask the Lord to take our lives and do whatever he wants to with our lives. So John made it to Australia, and it was there that John intended to try to raise more money and more people to help him bring the gospel to the New Hebrides.
One Sunday afternoon, John was passing a large church and saw many boys and girls going inside. John said to himself, I wish I could tell them how much God needs them as missionaries. John knew he needed help, and young people is who he knew would be able to come and help him. He followed the children into the church. After the pastor finished preaching, John went right up to the front of the church and said, I would like to talk to the boys and girls. The kind pastor said it would be all right, and John began. He said, I want to tell you about the islands where I live, said John Paton. Many hundreds of boys and girls, men and women live there, and they need someone to tell them how Jesus died for them and how they can be saved from their sins. Wouldn't it be wonderful, John said, if we could give enough money and our time to buy a ship so that missionaries and supplies could sail to the islands and that the islanders could be helped. The older people listened too, and they believed what John was telling them, that it was the truth, and they wanted to help. John was invited to other churches too, to tell of the needs of the island people. And he went to Scotland also. Well, God spoke to their hearts, and they gave their money to help John in their mission work. God can use you and me. Can he? Can God use you? Yes, he can. God can use any one of us. Do you remember that soon after John had arrived on the island, lost my place. Do you remember that soon after he had arrived, that John's wife and son had died after he had gone to the mission field? Well, while John was in Scotland preaching in the churches and telling and asking people to come and help, John had been alone for a long time, but God is faithful and knows what we need. And you know what? God gave John another wife to go back with him to help him in his work.
I just want to say something about why perhaps we might have a little trouble reading this. I don't know if you can see our notes, because there are a lot of details in reading the life of John Paton, which I've done, several books on his life. There are a lot of details that are left out of this little story, and we just felt it was kind of important to put them in here. So, of course, I've got scribbles all over the place and little things inserted and things highlighted, and it can drive my wife crazy because she's not exactly sure which part she's supposed to read, in spite of all of my, little arrows pointing over here.
Okay.
I know what they mean, but all right. Okay, anyway, let's get on with the story. So now, John has been to Australia. John has been to Scotland. He's been speaking in churches. This took about 4 years. He traveled around trying to raise money and raise helpers, and he did. Many people ended up going to the Hebrides as missionaries because of John's preaching. And as Margaret said, while John was in Scotland, the Lord gave him another wife. He gave him a wife who happened to be named Margaret. And so John and his wife Margaret went back to the New Hebrides as missionaries. This time, God led John and his wife to the island of Aniwa. The people on this island spoke a different language that John did not know. And since he and his wife could not understand them, they began at once to try to learn the meaning of the words that the people were speaking. As John started to build his house, some of the people came to help him. And as they worked, John listened carefully to the people as they spoke their language. He tried desperately to understand. Their words sounded strange to him at first. When he heard words that he knew meant something important, he would write those words down. Well, one day when John was building his house, the chief of that tribe came to help him. His name was Namakai. And as they worked, John and this chief together building his house, they tried to communicate, but it was very difficult because they really didn't understand each other's words. Well, John had an idea. After a little while, they ran out of nails. So John took a piece of wood and wrote a message on the piece of wood for his wife and gave the wood to Namakai. Chief Namakai, he said, and then pointed in the direction where his wife was, and let the chief know that he wanted him to take that piece of wood to his wife. He said, "Take the piece of wood to her, and the wood will speak to her." The chief just looked at the wood, very confused. The chief had never seen writing before. When Mrs. Paton sent him back to John with nails, the chief was amazed, and he realized that piece of wood really could speak.
On John's new island, there wasn't very much water. One morning, John told 2 old chiefs, "We'll dig down in the ground for water." They thought he was crazy. Who ever heard of getting water from the ground instead of from the sky? Well, John picked out a good spot and began digging. The chiefs kept watching John all the time. They thought he was crazy and might hurt himself, so they stayed there to protect him. But this was too much work for one man, so John got other tribesmen to help by giving them some fish hooks. They dug and dug and dug and didn't hit water. It was hot and everyone grew tired, and still no water. Finally, they had a big hole, a hole that was 12 feet deep. That's higher than your ceiling. Well, we'll quit for today, John said, as they put their tools down. And the next morning, what do you think John found when he went back to the hole? The whole thing had caved in. All that work for nothing, and so John had to start all over again.
One old chief came to John and said, "Please stop digging." He was certain that no water could come from the ground. But John kept right on digging. He dug and dug, but John also prayed and prayed. And he prayed out loud to Jesus. Then he stooped down and he felt the ground. It was wet. Oh, John thought, how I hope this water will be fresh and clean and not salt water seeping through the ground from the ocean. That evening he said to the chiefs, "I believe God will give us water from this hole by tomorrow." The old chiefs just shook their heads. Very early the next morning, John climbed down into the hole and started digging again. Suddenly, as he pushed his shovel deep into the hole, water came rushing up, filling up the hole. Well, John grabbed a big jug and filled it up with water and climbed up the ladder to the top. "Look," he cried.
One of the chiefs shouted, "God has given rain from the earth," as he shook the jug from John and took the jug and shook it. When John tasted the water and found it was pure and fresh, he said, "Thank you, Father." He just closed his eyes and prayed and thanked the Lord for answered prayer. Now they could all drink, and they wouldn't be afraid of running out of water. The island people wouldn't be able to say that the missionaries were robbing them of their precious water. John told the people, "God has given us water out of the earth in answer to our prayers." "The work of your God is wonderful," cried Chief Namakai. "None of our gods ever could have helped us in this way."
This is the part I like. Reading this story over today, kids, this was very exciting, this part. Chief Namakai called all the people together and said, "Listen to my words. Since our friend came to our island, he has told us many strange things that we could not understand. Of all his strange stories, the strangest was digging down in the ground to get rain. We whispered to each other, 'That man is crazy.' But John Paton prayed and prayed, and then dug and dug. He told us all that Jesus would answer his prayer and would give us all fresh water. Did Jesus answer his prayer?" And the people just nodded their heads up and down. Then the chief said, "From this day on, I will believe what our missionary tells us about Jesus Christ. I will not laugh at his words. I will believe them." The big chief stood tall and straight in front of his people, and he raised his hand up toward the sky. "From this day, my people," he said, "I must worship the God who has opened the ground and poured out water for us. Our gods could not hear. Our gods did not help us. I am now a follower of Jesus Christ." Oh, how glad John was that God had helped him show these dear people that God was real, that God could hear when they prayed, and that he was waiting to answer their prayers.
Then Chief Namakai cried, because as he got a hold of the Lord Jesus, he realized we must get rid of our gods. When Chief Namakai said this, all the tribes people ran toward their huts. What do you suppose they were going to do? They brought out their idols, little stones and wood idols that could not hear, that could not see, and that could not understand. We will burn them and bury them, said the chief. John Paton's God has sent rain from the earth. We believe he also sent his son from heaven to come to earth for us. In the weeks that followed, more and more people brought their idols to be burned or buried in a great pit. Some of them took their gods in their arms and waded, that means they swam, out into the sea, throwing them into the deep water. After that, they listened eagerly as John told them more about Jesus and his love for them. John worked hard to get the Bible written in the language of these people so they could read it for themselves. Every day, some would come and ask, "Is it finished? Is it finished?" One day, John's answer to their question was, "Yes, it is finished." "Does it speak my language?" asked the chief. "Make it speak to me," the chief cried excitedly. "Let me hear it speak."
John read to the chief from the book, the Bible in their language. What a blessed thing it is, kids, to have a Bible in our language that we can read. I know some of you maybe can't read yet, but when you're able to read, one of the greatest blessings in our lives as Christians is that God has given us a book, and God put that book in our language so that we could read it and we could understand it. But you know, there are many places in the world, there are many, many, many places in this world where the people still do not have the Bible in their language. They can't read the scriptures. Someone has to go there and tell them about Jesus Christ, and someone has to translate our Bible into their language so that they can know about Jesus Christ. We are really blessed. And so for these people to get a Bible from God in their language, can you imagine how excited they must have been? And the chief was very, very excited to have this book with the scriptures in his own language. And so John read to the chief from the book. Shouting with joy, the old chief cried out, "It does speak. It speaks like I speak." He got down on his knees in front of John and raised his arms and said, "Please, show me how to make it speak." First, of course, John had to teach the old chief the alphabet. Just like you and I had to learn the alphabet when we learned to read. We had to start with the letters and then learn the words and then so on and so forth. Well, John had to do that with these people. He had to teach them how to read. And he used the Bible to do that. He taught them how to read the Bible. You know, there was a time in our country many, many, many years ago, way before you were born, way before I was born, way before Pastor Dean was born. There was a time in our country when children went to school, they were taught to read from a King James Bible. That was their textbook, their reading book. And so obviously it is very important for us to learn to read the scriptures. And so John taught this old chief, Namakai, how to read, taught him the alphabet, and so that he could read the Bible. Soon the chief learned how to spell words, and in a little while he could read the Bible. He would travel all over the island, even without John. He would travel around the island and say to his people, "Let me read to you. Let me read to you. You can hear the words of God speak to you for yourself." Chief Namakai was always true to Jesus Christ. He became a kind of a missionary himself and bringing the gospel to his people. When he was old and it was time for him to die, he said, "I am going to die, but on that great day when Jesus comes back to earth, I will rise to meet him just like my Bible tells me." Well, John and Margaret continued to preach the gospel on the island of Aniwa and on some of the other islands in the New Hebrides. And on Aniwa and some of the other islands, thousands and thousands of those natives who had once been cannibals, who had once been completely ignorant of the gospel, who did not know anything about God or Jesus Christ or salvation, those people got saved. And on some of those islands, it's said that every single person living on those islands became a Christian. And you know, the Spirit of God did that. The Lord gets all the glory, not John Paton. He was just a man. He was just a servant. But he was a faithful servant. And he was a servant who, when he was still young, like some of you, he gave himself to the Lord. And the Lord can do great things with any one of us if we would just give ourselves completely and ask the Lord to use us. And God did great things with John and Margaret Paton. They lived the rest of John's life as missionaries. He died as an old man, but he left behind a wonderful legacy, a wonderful story that we're still reading about and telling you about today, because more than 100 years ago, one boy was saved in Scotland and wanted to be used of God, and the Lord used him in a great way. And I hope that you'll want that also. I hope that you'll want not only to be saved if you're not saved, but also that if you are saved, that you'll really want the Lord to use you and let your life glorify Jesus Christ. That's the most important thing. That is the most important thing for any of us as Christians, is that we would just live to please the Lord. Aren't you glad that John Paton gave up friends and family and his home in Scotland to go to the New Hebrides Islands to tell those people that Jesus loved them? Imagine what would have happened to those people if no one had gone to tell them about Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. Every one of us has to be a missionary. You can be a missionary. You don't even have to go to the other side of the world to be a missionary. You can be a missionary to your friends. You can be a missionary to people you may go to school with whenever school starts again. But you can be a missionary to the people in your neighborhood. You can give people gospel tracts. You can tell them about Jesus Christ. And then maybe one day the Lord will send you farther and farther away to other people that have never heard about the Lord. But I love the story of John Paton. He's one of our heroes, and his life is something that we ought to, take as a good example for us. Someone who gave everything they had to Jesus Christ and was used greatly. Now, I want to just leave you with two questions. You remember the two most important things that John ever did? First of all, he got saved. That was the most important thing. And boys and girls, if you're not saved, I want to encourage you, please speak to your parents and ask mom and dad. I know mom and dad can help you and give you the scriptures and open a Bible and tell you of what Jesus Christ did for you, how much he loves you, how he died for you on the cross. There may be some of you listening who are not yet saved. And so I encourage you to talk to your parents about that. Talk to the Lord about that. But if you are saved, boys and girls, I want to just remind you that your life belongs to Jesus Christ. And may you just have a heart's desire. May you want with all your heart to be pleasing to the Lord. And I hope you will be. We love you. And we have a brand new story next Friday night at 7 o'clock. And it's an exciting one. And we're looking forward to seeing you. We'll see you then, if not sooner. But thank you for being with us tonight. We love you very much.
Love you.
And we'll say good night. God bless you.
God bless.